Welcome to another Q&A session. We are still in Edmonton and it has been snowing like crazy. And I have the wonderful privilege of doing an interview with Michel LaFleur, who is a RE/MAX real estate agent. Okay, and what really caught my attention with Michel is we've met at a couple of networking functions specifically for real estate. And the thing that really caught me with Michel was that he has a concept about buying into negative cash flowing properties that is different than what a lot of real estate investors will do. So I wanted to bring Michel on, get his concept out there and talk a little bit more about that. So Michel, can you introduce yourself and let everybody know what you do in terms of real estate and how long have you been in the industry?
So my name is Michel LaFleur. I work as a realtor with RE/MAX Real Estate here in Edmonton. I specialize in residential real estate, particularly investment properties. I've been an investor myself, a REIN member since about 2010. I've graduated the Rapid Cash program a couple of times now, and I kind of eat, sleep, and breathe real estate. Edmonton and areas have been my area of focus, and we're really looking to spread the investor message and how we can help others get towards their goals.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Now you mentioned REIN and the Rapid Cash. So for somebody who's not familiar with REIN and Rapid Cash, can you explain what that is?
So REIN, it's an international network. It's the Real Estate Investment Network, or Real Estate Intelligence Network as of recently. Yes. But it's really a school of thought, putting a bunch of like-minded people into the same room, or at least the same network, be it online and different places across the country. And there's a lot of education about investing in real estate, the what, the why, the how, the where, and really connecting investors and we'll say key players such as property managers, realtors, mortgage brokers, etc. So it kind of puts everyone in the same room so we can all learn and grow together.
Yeah. Now, REIN is not just for seasoned investors, just to clarify. It's also for people who are very new into real estate and want to get that knowledge before they take that jump in. As well.
I would say it's a good mix. There's a lot of seasoned investors who have done well in the room, and they are more perhaps the people we see on stage more often at the meetings. If you're a new investor starting out, I would absolutely recommend looking into REIN. Sign up, come in, sit down, learn. And I think for a lot of people, it's a good starting point. If you're doing your diligence about an investment, I would absolutely suggest get into the REIN room, become active, and meet some other people in the network.
Yeah, and absolutely, like the knowledge that you get from one of these meetings is amazing, but it's also the conversations that you have with individuals, at the water jug or at the coffee machine, right? Like I met you during one of the breaks. Right. And I've met other individuals as well who are, thinking about buying a deal and they just need another eye to help them analyze or help them talk through that purchase. Right. And so it's a great resource to have. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Great. Now, you also mentioned the Rapid Cash. Can you tell us what that's about?
So the Rapid Cash program, I guess, was first introduced to me through REIN. So there's a lawyer here in the city, Barry McGuire. They put together a big educational program. It is geared towards investing in real estate, but everything is creative. So the concept of Rapid Cash kind of started as how can you make money quickly with real estate. So we talk a little bit about fix and flip. But the premise of it is kind of what happens if you don't fall into the standard investor bucket. As a realtor, we're so used to working with investors. It's 20% down plus holding costs plus renovations. You fast forward a number of months and now you have a property that typically cash flows. The creative side of things, we look at like agreements for sale, rent to own, assignment of contracts. Those are kind of the main ones we look at, but you can also get creative with just vendor financing. You get scenarios where people own a property outright and they don't want to sell because they're scared of the tax man. So we look at how can we structure investments so that they become win-win for the buyer and the seller. So the Rapid Cash program has really opened up my eyes to this. The first time I did the course, I was actually like, whoa, whoa, there's so much stuff here. That was almost hard to digest and take it all in. So I did the course again. And, if it comes up, I will probably do it a third time as well. And I'd suggest anyone with a limited budget that kind of wants to open your mind to other options, it is a really good starting point for the investing in real estate.
Yeah. And I love the point that you made about doing something another time just to make sure that you get that understanding, because sometimes when you hear things the first time, it doesn't sink in. Like you hear it, but you don't understand it. Right. And so hearing it a second, third, or fourth time, sometimes that makes it different. Right. So like I've been on a lot of these mindset programs, training programs, and every time I go and I hear something, even though I've heard it for years, just that one time will make a difference, and something will click, a light bulb will go off, and I'm like, oh my God, that's a great idea. And then there's actions after that allows me to implement something. Right. But it takes sometimes several times to be told something before you get what that message is. Right. So I love it that you're so open about redoing something just to make sure that you understand exactly, what that message is. So that's great.
And I think it's, you can never get too much education. And it was one, I guess, as a realtor, we've been trained in a certain way to think about the industry and the process of how this works. So it was a little bit of like shell shock. It's kind of a disruption to my thought patterns that I kind of felt like a deer in headlights. And like, what did he just say? And then the weekend went by and I was still trying to digest some of the concepts. So it is good to take some time, put it into practice. But again, you do essentially the same course a few years later. And you can still learn more. We were connecting at an acre. I think I've been to about a dozen of them now, and I still learn something new at every event I go to. Yes. Something new from the industry, but then we meet connections, have a conversation with maybe a topic we haven't discussed before. So you're always learning. Even if you've done it 100 times, I'd still say keep going, because you can always get more information.
All right. Fantastic. So now before we get into this whole concept of negative cash flow, can you tell me some of the deals that you're working on right now?
Well, we've got a lot on the go right now, which is a good thing to have, because all eyes are saying that the industry is slow. Things are not happening. So I've got the privilege to be working with a developer, and we have an investor client where essentially we are looking for specific plots of land to build specific properties. So our target right now is student housing, and it's bringing us around the university. So there's a few, I guess that is an instant where, negative cash flow can be a good thing because it's part of a bigger plan. I have a number of clients that are looking for, I'm going to call them fixer-uppers, be it fix and flip, or what I refer to as a BRRRR, which is buy, renovate, rent, and refinance. So it's kind of like flipping
our method.
Very appropriate for Edmonton this time of year. But I have a number of clients who do that. And then we also have some clients that are just looking for a straight up rental. They want something with a legal suite that, kind of like a plug and play. You buy it, put tenants in, and away you go. Then I also work with, I'm going to say, normal real estate consumers, meaning, the family with the kids and the dog that want to buy a house, move there, live there forever, being close to school, work, lifestyle, etc. So we have a good mix of the types of clients that I work with. And in the context of negative cash flow, I also work with a number of what I call creative clients. So as a realtor, I'm often approached saying, Michelle, I have this property. I need out, whatever the circumstances may be. Here's my bottom line number. With the market being a little bit slower, there are times that a seller maybe is not able to afford to sell. So if we look at mortgage payout penalties, you pay a realtor and it takes 90 to 120 days to sell. Sometimes those don't work well. So those essentially become pocket listings where I'm looking for creative investors to try to find a win-win scenario between a seller who has something and needs out and an investor that collects that kind of product.
Okay, that's great. So why don't you tell me a little bit about, okay, so you use the term creative investor.
Yeah.
What is the difference between a creative investor versus a regular investor?
Really, the way that an investor looks at a deal. So, as a REIN member, I mean, most of us are taught it's 20% down payment as an investor to buy a property that you're not going to live in. It's a good idea to budget for a reserve, maybe partner up if you need a contractor, manager, et cetera. But I'm going to call that a regular investor.
Okay.
The creative investors, there's an analogy I got from another guy, but he basically said we all start out with a bag of money, and that bag of money is fixed. So if you're doing the standard model, with 20% down, depending how big your bag of money is, that might buy you 1, 2, 3 properties, but most of us run out of money relatively quickly. So if we have that fixed amount of cash, the creative investor saying, how much can I get for this? Mm-hmm. So they start to look for deals that instead of 20% down, maybe it's you catch up 2 months of arrears on property taxes and a mortgage, and then you're into that property. Rather than getting a mortgage through a bank, they're saying, well, how can we finance this so that I can pay for the property without needing to qualify for a mortgage?
Yeah.
So that's kind of where the creativity comes in.
Yeah. And actually now some of the investors are having to put more than 20% down, right? Like, so 20 is sort of the guideline that we throw out there as a number, but I've heard of cases where people now are having to put 25, 30%. And in one case that I've heard was 35% down just to be able to buy an investment property, right? So that 20% really is, it's a minimum, right?
I think it works. My understanding with today's market is you'll get to about 5 transactions that way. And then they start saying, well, now you might be commercial. I often joke about, getting hit by a bus, but the bank looks at any investor, says, well, that man or woman has $5 million of mortgages. What happens if she doesn't make it? So then that's kind of where the banks start to say, well, up the ante, now it's 25, 30, 35% down payment. Yeah. Or they may look at you, I guess, in a commercial lens where they're just saying, who is backing the payments should this fall through? Yeah. It's requiring more and more money to do what us investors want to do.
Exactly. And I got to that point after my 3rd property, even though, so I was working as a full-time engineer, as a project manager. And I got to that at my 3rd property. So, I didn't even have to get to my 5th one to be told by the bank, Huong, you've already maxed out on all your mortgages, right? So if you can imagine, like, I've paid them all off and then just re-leverage them. And so after my 3rd one, I had to get creative with how I financed my 4th and 5th and my 6th and 7th, right? Yeah. And so now I'm past that point of even going to the banks now. Right. So now there's creative ways of getting deals done so that you're not going through the banks anymore. Right?
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Okay. So I understand too that you have a lot of family in real estate.
Yes, I guess we've been kind of fortunate to be close to the REIN network. We do have some family affiliated with there. So we've had a lot of, I guess we'll call it vicarious experience through that relationship where we've been exposed to the education, but also the back end. What happens when the deal doesn't go as planned, when there's a cash call on a project, when you have a vacancy, when you have a flood, when you have a joint venture agreement that isn't going so well. So we've kind of got to see, from the back end that way. It's been quite fortunate. And then on the real estate family, my wife and I, we do all this together. So we were investors first. She became a realtor, and then we had kids. So I became the realtor, and she is, we kind of call her our domestic engineer. She's not currently licensed, but she does a ton of work for the family business, be it supporting me as a realtor as well as on the investor side of things. So we kind of do this together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree with that. Like some of my coaching clients, one person would be 100% in, and then the secondary person or the significant other would be sort of involved part-time. And I see situations where, some of my other coaching clients, their significant other is not involved at all, right? And it's not always, if you can do real estate with your family members, that's ideal, because then you're sharing the wealth, everybody's moving together, and it makes the conversation a lot easier when you're going and maxing out a line of credit or needing to source funds at a high interest rate, right? Whereas if you're dealing with if you have a significant other who doesn't understand those concepts, it's a bit of a harder conversation to say, hey, I'm maxing out our $500,000 line of credit at 10%.
Yeah. Well, it can be uncomfortable for a lot of people. And I guess maybe to back up a little bit. So my background before I got into any of real estate, I'm a clinical kinesiologist by trade. So I used to work in essentially the health and fitness industry, a lot of rehab. And the constant observation that I had is, really stress kills. So we could constantly make you fitter, make you faster, leaner, kind of whatever you're looking for. But when I'd sit down with couples, most often it came down to stress and money. So I started thinking, well, how can we help that scenario? So I think bringing people together, having, both spouses on the same page is really important. But financial health really matters. And we see a lot of people, they're working really hard to make a dollar today. But what happens when you retire? What happens if you work the next 20 years without a pension plan? Then what? So I think it actually is really healthy for families to do this together.
Absolutely.
Some of the old school mentality, there's, maybe call it blue hat, red hat, kind of roles within a family, but I do think that everyone should be involved, because it can be very unhealthy if you just put all your trust into one partner and suddenly you look and say, wow, our LOC is maxed out, we're negative 500, what's happening? So I think you definitely need to have your family involved, or at least aware and supportive of what you're doing in real estate.
Absolutely. So now just to clarify, you threw out a term there, LLC. So for those of you who are watching, an LLC is a line of credit, which is the same thing as a HELOC. Okay. So, so just on your point there, I see that all the time, because one of the programs that I offer is to help families eliminate their mortgage. And I see couples who get to that retirement age and they can't retire, or really they still have to keep a part-time job because they still have a mortgage. The other situation that I see with a lot of mortgage holders is that the husband would be the one who understands all the numbers, made all the payments against the mortgage. And if something happens to the husband, the wife is left going, I don't even know what my mortgage payments are. I don't even know, when this mortgage is going to be paid off, right? And so I agree 100% with you. Like all the family members, even the kids, like bring in the kids to understand, right? Because if we ever get into a situation like 08 and 09, where a lot of people lost their jobs and struggled to pay their mortgage payments, and we saw a lot of people lose their houses back then, right? And if we ever have a situation like that again, where people are potentially losing their jobs and can't make their mortgage payments, you're going to lose your roof, right? And for a lot of people, having that house is their biggest investment. Right.
It is. And I think even when you're looking at families, we have 2 young kids at home, and we work pretty hard to try to fold them into our business. At 1 and 2 years of age, they don't know a lot, but they are understanding a lot of concepts like money. Mom and dad have to work hard to make money, and we are working hard to put roofs over other people's heads so that they can have the security. I think nowadays there's a lot of, maybe it's a generational thing, I don't know, but financial literacy is not well known. And, stereotypically it's been the husband who says, don't worry about it, I took care of everything. But what happens if, he loses his job, or, something happens to the parents, then the kids are left with, these patterns and habits. So I think it's good to educate them, and even have your kids understand, why is mom and dad doing real estate? Why does this matter?
Yeah.
So definitely a family model, the way we look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one of the things that I did early on was whenever I went to open houses, I would take my son with me. And it got to the point where he actually got used to going to open houses, taking off his shoes, going in and checking out the rooms with me at the same time, and actually commenting about the room sizes. And he was only like 4 when we started this. So it was actually like a fun weekend thing to do, right? So.
It's good to have the kids involved.
Yeah. So, okay, so sorry, we sort of digressed there quite a bit. So let's get back on the concept of negative cash flow. And this is what really caught my attention when we spoke at one of the networking functions, was you mentioned to me there are times when it's good to have negative cash flow, or to invest in a property that is negative cash flowing. And for the 20 years that I've been investing in real estate, with my buy and hold and lease options and so forth like that, I've always stayed away from negative cash flow properties. And as a minimum, I always target at least $100 per unit positive cash flow for any deal as a minimum that I do. Right. Yeah. And so anything that has a negative number to it, I don't even like within the 5 minutes or 10 minutes that I'm looking at a property, if there's a negative number, I just chuck it and then I go on to the next analysis. Right. And so when we met and you mentioned, hey, you know what, there is actually a good time to hold a negative cash flow in property. I'm like, okay, let's hear what this guy's got to say, because this is contrary to so much education out there. So explain to me when it is a good time to have a negative cash flow in place.
Okay, so I want to preface this saying that this would be a strategy that I would only really use with an investor who is experienced and really understands the market and what they're doing. So if this would maybe be your first rental property, do not go for negative cash flow. Stick to the positive. Everything else you've heard is correct. But there's really two main scenarios where I can think of where negative cash flow can be a good thing. So as a realtor, I mentioned that I work with a developer and we're targeting certain areas. So if you as an investor are really focused and you know you want to build your portfolio in this neck of the woods, wherever that may be, a certain area, maybe it's a neighborhood, proximity to a certain employer or certain school, essentially the amount of land available in that location is fixed. So if something comes up and you know you want it because you're going to build, say, a student house on that property, or you want to collect 3 or 4 lots so that perhaps you can resurrect an apartment building in the future, you want to get your hands on that land almost at any cost. So in the case of student housing, we've seen scenarios where they say, well, this house is now for sale, but there are students in it. There's a lease until June. The house is for sale, but you must assume those tenants. So, if you think of around the university area, so some of the numbers on a purchase price are quite high. You buy that today and there's students renting it, it is going to be negative cash flow until the lease ends. A lot of times, if you think of these properties, typically they're going to be 70 to 100 years old. A lot of times they're just going to be full of students. So a 2-story home might have 5 students that are paying an average of $500 each per month as roommates, so they can live affordably close to school. So when you buy that, say for $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, and that is what properties close to the university are selling for, and that and more, it is going to be negative cash flow. But if your plan is that you want that lot because you're going to build something bigger, to sit on negative cash flow for say 6, 8, 12 months, I wouldn't say more than a year in these scenarios, it becomes part of your initial investment. So they look at it saying, well, all in, if I bought it for, we'll say $500,000 and we were negative $500 a month for 6 months. They do the math on that and they say, well, for us to do that was $503,000. That's what it cost us to get this property. And then they, future construction, they build whatever they build, and then the cash flow calculation changes. So that is one instance where, buying negative cash flow can be good. It's if you have a future use for the property where you really want that property.
So now the future use of that doesn't have to be student housing again?
No. Well, there are people who even, if they want to buy the house across the street, not because it's great, but because it would be super easy to manage and you've always had an interest in that house. So there are times where you might just say, you know what, I'll buy it, I'll honor the lease agreement, but I want that property for whatever it is. Perhaps you want to put your kid in that house as soon as they're old enough. Perhaps you have, aging parents that you want to be close to home. Perhaps you've always, really admired the game of Monopoly and you wanted everything on that street.
So now, just a couple of comments. If you're buying a house for your kids and they're moving in there and not paying you rent, that is definitely negative cash flow.
It is negative cash flow, but if you think of that as the investor, though, you put your kids into that property. Inevitably, someone's going to make that mortgage payment, so that becomes an investment for you as a family investment, even though the kids might not be paying fair market rent or whatever that case ends up being. But really, there's a concept of land banking. So there are some people, especially if you look around the city of Edmonton, it's growing quite a bit, and there's not a whole lot of raw land left. There's a lot of eyes looking at like the Blatchford area, the old airport. But otherwise, you got a few chunks of dirt peppered around the Anthony Henday that are just waiting to be developed. So if you could buy that today as bare land, it's going to be negative cash flow. But fast forward 5, 10, 20 years from now, what will the value of that land be for development purposes? There's people at a smaller scale in a community that, even that idea of communal living, where you get, say, a group of 4 or 5 houses that more or less kind of work together. Sometimes if your vision is to have those properties in a tight area, getting your hands on a property today might mean negative cash flow, but at that future date, however far into the future it is, be it 6 months or a decade, you will get better use of it. And if you look at the escalating prices of real estate, lately, there's a lot of doom and gloom in the Edmonton market. Prices are down a bit compared to a year ago, but the trend is always going up. So if you can buy a land for, say, we'll call it $1 million today, 10 years from now, you won't be able to make that same purchase for that price. So, to buy negative cash flow today, to have land that's going to appreciate for whatever your future use is, that is one way that works.
So now just to put a disclaimer on that, we're not suggesting that you buy land at negative cash flow or buy a property at negative cash flow and sit on it for 10 or 20 years in the hopes of the appreciation. Okay, because you might be forced to sell sooner than when the appreciation actually takes place. Okay, so what you're talking about, Michelle, is really for somebody who is able to sit on that property for years and years and years and wait for that appreciation, right? Like, so appreciation, so to buy land or property for appreciation growth is one strategy that not many people support, just because you can't always count on that appreciation.
Correct.
And that appreciation percentage is up and down all the time.
And I wouldn't buy just for appreciation. That's lucrative investing. And you may win, you may lose big.
Exactly.
But with the idea of land banking, I would say buy a property today that fits your future vision, whatever that is. So again, some people say, well, it's student housing. Some people want to buy the whole block just to have it. Some people want to be able to say, you know what, all 10 of my doors are in this neighborhood. So it might be years, it might be months. Like if you buy a property that's negative cash flow, maybe underperforming, you ride out that lease and then you make it better. So as an example, here in the city, there's actually a lot of what are currently illegal basement suites. The city's coming up with a plan, gives everyone about a year to try to bring them up to code. But if you were to buy that today as an illegal suite, yeah, maybe it is negative cash flow, but your tenants are done, we'll say spring. You can go in there, make the renovations, have it as a legal suite, raise the rents, and then it becomes positive cash flow.
Correct. Okay.
So as long as it fits your long-term plan and vision, it's a good thing. If you don't have a plan, don't buy based on speculation.
Right. So absolutely. So this negative cash flow strategy that you're talking about is not for new investors, right? So definitely not for somebody who's doing their first or second. I would even say, like, if it's your third property, I would still say don't, make sure you analyze the numbers and bring somebody in to help you figure out, okay, what is your strategy long term, right? Because if you're going to be carrying negative cash flow properties, that means it's money coming out of your pocket and it's post-tax money that you're making, right? Yeah. So just keep that all in mind. Okay. So now you mentioned there was 2 situations where it would be good to do negative cash flow. So one of them you mentioned was this potentially just changing the use, right? And then what's the second one?
So the other side of it is really on the creative side of things. So I guess one hand, land banking, future use of the property. Okay. That I think falls better under the realtor bucket. When we get into creative real estate, now we're talking about deals that don't necessarily involve you getting a mortgage, and that don't necessarily involve you putting 20, 25, 35% down payment to get into the property. So agreement for sale. As a concept, essentially that is a future dated sale agreement where the buyer takes possession or use of the property immediately. So there are scenarios, not to paint a bad picture, but a lot of times it's going to be job loss, divorce, circumstances where someone needs out yesterday. So they look and they say, they call the realtor, they say, well, what is this worth? I owe X, but you're telling me that the market value today is actually lower than that. So if it's a negative equity or low equity.
Yeah.
So I guess for the case of an example, we'll say if a property is worth $400,000 on today's market, you put it on MLS, it's going to take 2 to 3 months to sell, and hopefully you're going to sell that property for $385,000, $390,000. Not too many properties are getting list price. And then you got to pay a realtor on top of that. And then there's often a penalty to break your mortgage.
Yes.
So then if the seller says, well, my mortgage is actually $395,000. And we say, well, if we take out about $15,000 for realtor fees, another $3,000 to break your mortgage, and then we put in $10,000 of wiggle room for negotiations, that person is stuck. They can't really afford to sell. So then that's kind of where we go to other investors, and we might say, well, okay, Mr. or Mrs. Creative Investor, we have an opportunity to buy this property. This is the mortgage details. This is the monthly cost to get that property. So there's scenarios where you can buy into these, and every seller scenario is different. Sometimes they want $5,000 because that's what it costs to move them across the country to whatever comes next. Sometimes there's scenarios where they might be in arrears. They say, well, we're actually behind 3 months of mortgage payments and 6 months of condo fees. So in that case, the buy into that deal is not 20% down. It's going to be, what does the seller need
to get caught up? Maintenance fees, the taxes, all of that stuff to get up, and their mortgage payments, right? So that the property doesn't foreclose on them.
Exactly. So there's other scenarios too where sometimes people, they just want out, and for whatever reason they just don't want to deal with a realtor and timelines. They just want to know that it's sold today and they don't have to worry about it.
Right.
So seller motivation is not always rational. That's one of Barry Maguire's lines, but it's true. Sometimes they just say, things are challenging. I just want a sale. I don't care what it is. This is my number.
Yeah.
So if you have a scenario where, I guess, say for easy numbers, the purchase price on an agreement for sale almost doesn't matter. It's mortgage balance owing. And so that's kind of the number you work with. And then what are the holding costs? So if you were to do an agreement for sale, you're taking over the mortgage payments, whatever those are, plus the taxes, plus the insurance. And then you as the buyer would also be then taking over all responsibility of the property for profit or for loss. So that means that you'd be responsible for your renovating, putting tenants in, supporting vacancy if it's vacant. So the buy-in on these things, if we say there's a property, it costs $2,000 a month as your holding costs with that. But you could only rent it for $1,850. So, quick and easy math, that's negative $150 cash flow. If you're using a professional manager and a few other systems, it's going to be even more negative cash flow. So that doesn't sound very good. I mean, negative $200 a month, that's $2,400 a year. That's a part-time job for some people. But where the investment strategy comes into play is if we were to buy that and say, well, maybe $10,000 of renovations, we can raise the rent of that property from $1,800 to $2,000. So at a higher level, we don't know what that property looks like. But with the creative investor, the big one they're really looking at is mortgage pay down. So if we say, well, you're negative $200 a month for a mortgage pay down, and we have a contract that's good for 8 years with that mortgage. You fast forward 8 years, hopefully there's some appreciation. Don't bank on that, but it hopefully will happen. Consumer price index is around 2% per year, so we'll call that inflation. But over 8 years, we can know and calculate exactly what will the mortgage pay down be. So if that property is worth $400 today, the mortgage is $395, you can't afford to sell today. We fast forward 8 years from now, even if nothing changes, you will be able to afford to sell that property for $400,000 8 years from now. And the mortgage of $395, I don't know exactly, but if we go 8 years, maybe the mortgage is $320. Right. So as quick and dirty math, I mean, you've made some money just on the mortgage pay down there. And if we say 8 years at negative $200 a month, that's $2,400 per year. That's about $18,000. In which case, you're still coming ahead out ahead about 60 grand in that example. So again, that's not, and I guess an easy example to follow, and it's not an easy one for a novice investor to get into. But there are ways that these work.
So now just to share, in Alberta with the oil industry sort of on the decline over the last few years, there are a lot of properties, say by Fort Mac, Fort Saskatchewan, like there's places that had seen a boom before the 0809 years. A lot of those properties soared, right? And we are now in a situation where a lot of people who purchased properties at the super high prices are on the way up during back then. They now have mortgages higher than what those properties are worth now. Right. So it's like from what I've seen in my research, it's mostly in Alberta where because of the oil industry. And so there's lots of people who have those high mortgages, higher than the value of the property. And the banks are not going to foreclose on them because even if the banks take over that property, they're not going to be able to sell it and recoup their money. So it's actually better for them to let the current owner keep the property and pay off the mortgage lower. And then at some point when that mortgage comes down lower than the actual value of the property, and if the owner misses a payment or two, then that's maybe when the bank will foreclose on them. But until that point, right? So there's tons of properties in the Alberta area which fits this criteria that you're talking about.
Yeah. Absolutely. The main buckets that I see these properties are what I'm going to call distress scenario. So that's the job relocation, a failed relationship, a fire sale, whatever it ends up being. But there are people who just need out, and they're in, I'm going to say, tough circumstances. Another common one that I've seen is actually on the new home builds. So again, the last handful of years, the market hasn't been as great as an overall or higher level, but builders are still building. So they incentivize a lot of people to get in there. So they call it like a flexible down payment, $5,000, you can get into a brand new house that's worth $400. I mean, that sounds awesome as a first time buyer, but what they don't realize is that by the time CMHC tax their premium on there, the developer and the bank inflate the price a little bit so that they can get some money out of it. You buy a $400,000 property with $5,000 down. When you get your keys, your mortgage is like $418,000. So you live there for say 2 years. Now your mortgage is $395,000 and market value is maybe $400,000 still. Right. So these are common scenarios, and unfortunately, a lot of young couples just don't make it. So sometimes there's a divorce. Sometimes there's, I bought a house and now I got transferred to Toronto. What do I do with my property in Edmonton?
Exactly. So now let me just sort of put a plug in here because so we have a book called Path to Mortgage Freedom in 10 years. And in this book, we talk about that scenario that you talked about. Okay, a lot of young families will relocate within, 5 or 7 years of buying a property. And then what happens to that property, right? And so we go into that scenario in the book showing that when you move and you take on a new mortgage somewhere else, you're actually starting at year 0 again on your mortgage. And so now you're taking another 25, 30 years to pay it off. So we go into that scenario to talk about what the negative effect is on your mortgage on that, right? Because right now, even with our low interest rates, we're still paying 1.5 times more for whatever property you're buying, right? And so if you can get your mortgage down to 10 years and pay off your mortgage in 10 years, like a lot of the families who are in that situation where their house mortgage now is way higher than the value, if they had paid off their mortgage in 10 years time, they wouldn't be in that situation because their mortgage would be such a small amount, right? And they would be able to sell their house at the reduced value and still walk away with a profit.
Yeah.
Right. So you don't always have to be in that situation.
And there's times where, again, the distress scenario is the most common where we find these creative ones, but there's also times when people just want out and the traditional, the most common ways out just don't work. Yeah. So as a realtor, I know my business quite well, but I do know that there are a number of others who will go meet Mr. or Mrs. Seller and say, you know what, there's no money here, I'm out. So they won't even market that property just because, those guys want to get paid in their business as well. And if there's not enough money to pay the deal, they tend to lose the interest of the typical real estate crowd fairly quickly. Another scenario that I've seen is ones that maybe have some equity, but not enough that they can pull it out. So when you get into refinancing, for example, most banks nowadays is 75 or 80% loan to value.
Well, actually, so in some cases I've heard it's actually gone down about 65%. Right.
Oh, I'd love to meet those lenders. I have some clients who benefit from that.
So that's really to protect the banks, right? Because if they're lending you less loan to value, then there's more cushion for them, right? And the reason why they're doing that is to protect them, right? So that totally makes sense. But 2-3 years ago, it used to be 75-80%, and now it's it could be anywhere down to 65%.
Yeah, well, and in the case so if we talk of that $400,000 house, maybe if we'll talk hypothetically, but maybe you bought that house a dozen years ago, you've lived there, you've used it, everything is good, and you've done a bunch of renovations to raise the value in the property, and you have refinanced it already, and it still is worth $400 today, but you owe, maybe we'll say $380, $375. So you do have some equity in that property. We'll call it $25,000 of equity, but that's not enough that you can refinance it to pull that out.
That's right.
So you basically, to get your 25 grand of equity out, you need to sell for 400,000 and have zero fees taken out of that, which means not working with a realtor and not having to pay your bank to break that mortgage. So there's times when a seller will just say, what I want is to be out today. I'll leave that 20,000 of equity in there. I just want out. So they're usually more looking in a short term. So again, if you could buy that property at negative $100 a month cash flow, plug and play. It's a single family home. You buy it, you take over all their payments. You are negative cash flow, but you get to the end of that road, there's already $25,000 built into that deal because the seller is leaving the equity on the table. You fast forward a number of years, the mortgage gets paid down, appreciation hopefully goes up. The bigger the gap is, that's really the prize that the investor is looking for in these creative deals. And if you amortize that negative cash flow, be it $100 or $200 a month, there's a lot of times where you can just build that into your costs of doing business. If it costs you $5,000 to buy into this deal, maybe that catches the seller up on those couple payments. And then you meet with your joint venture partner and say, you know what, over the next 5 years, we need another $6,000. It's $100 a month negative cash flow. You build that into your down payment up front. It's in the bank account, it's there. Do the math on that. That 11 grand is way less than 20% down had you bought that the typical way. Because that investor would have put that's $80,000 down up front, plus you still have your vacancy allowances and all those things. Whereas this case, it's a smaller buy-in up front, and you just set aside, call it a reserve, but a chunk of money to cover that negative cash flow. With your eyes on the prize is really going to be the mortgage pay down and that future value of the property.
Okay. So now all the math that you just went into there, I would definitely tell a newbie investor, okay, give you a call and go through those numbers to make sure you understand how that number's like when you threw out that $80,000, right? Make sure you understand how Michelle got that number. Okay. Because if you don't understand that 80,000 came from that 20% down payment that would be needed, okay, then this is not a strategy for you to jump both feet in. Like, make sure you understand the numbers, make sure you know the cost of doing business, okay, for the duration. Because if you go down this path and you don't really get that number, you're going to be paying out of your pocket until you offload that property as well. Okay.
Yeah, you want to do your financial responsibility. And I mean, a lot of the investors I deal with nowadays are acting on behalf of partnerships. So a lot of people use joint venture money. So you may have, partner A, partner B, partner C. And when you start out, you say, well, this is how much money we need to do this deal. So get that money up front. Don't make any promises saying, let's buy negative cash flow. I'll fund the negative $200 a month, because that doesn't work very well. Yeah. But plan for it up front. And there's a lot of times where you can make a win-win scenario. In those examples, I mean, the seller wants out, so you're helping them, but you as an investor are also wanting to grow your portfolio. So that could be a win for you there. And I think with this idea, I would really encourage any of the the viewers or listeners from this to look into the Rapid Cash program. Or I believe Barry Maguire, they're actually in this month in Calgary are doing what's called an AFS intensive workshop.
Yes. So I will put that information down in the description as well. So AFS, explain what that term is.
It's an agreement for sale, and it's basically a way of utilizing seller financing to buy a property today and have it close at a future date. So the premise of it is essentially you buy in for whatever it costs you today. You take over all use of the property, which includes profit or loss, be it covering vacancy, investing into renovations, whatever it may be. And it often aligns with when the mortgage matures at a future date. So as a way of saving the seller money on these penalties for breaking your mortgage, you basically break the mortgage at a time when there are no penalties. For the investor, the longer of a timeline you get with vendor financing, the better, because what they're really looking for is mortgage pay down in that period of time. So that's a kind of a quick version of what is an agreement for sale. But again, I would encourage any of the viewers to do your homework, some research, and consider getting into a course to learn more about it.
Absolutely, yeah. So, so Barry, who you've mentioned several times, he is running that course in Calgary. I think next week, right?
I want to say the 17th in Calgary.
Yeah, exactly. So, but there is information about AFS through the REIN recordings as well. So the information is out there, right? And absolutely, I do agree with you. Now, keep in mind, this strategy is not for newbie investors. Like it seriously, make sure you do your due diligence, understand what you're getting into. Okay. So, okay, perfect. So you talked about the two situations where negative cash flow is a possibility. And just to make sure we get that point across, okay, this negative cash flowing concept or idea is not for newbie investors. Like really, it's for somebody who's seasoned, somebody who has a game plan, who has who's willing to take that extra stress, because it is a difficult position to be in when you're paying out of your own pocket every month for a property that's not cash flowing. Okay, now I think we jumped over the concept of what is negative cash flow. Can you explain a couple words what that is?
Negative cash flow, and all investors look at things different, but essentially if your income from a property is less than your total expenses, you're going to be in a position of negative cash flow. So easy numbers, if it costs you $2,000 a month to own that property between your mortgage, property taxes, and insurance, but you're only renting it for $1,800, you're negative $200. Depending on the investor model, some people will budget, 5% for vacancy, 5% repairs and maintenance, maybe 10% for a manager. So if you put those in, your negative cash flow is going to be higher. There are some investors who say, well, it's negative cash flow with all that, but I self-manage, so I don't pay the 10%. So that's kind of a way that you can, I guess, shrink or grow that negative cash flow depending on how you run your portfolio and your business. But yeah, the quick version is that you're earning less than what it costs you to own that property.
Right. And so part of the expenses is everything that it takes you to operate that property. So it includes your interest payments, any legal fees, any accounting, the utilities, property taxes, insurance, like everything under the sun that you need to operate that property is an expense. And any income coming in from the rental, whether you Airbnb it, rent it out by the room, rent it to a family, it doesn't matter, whatever that rental income is. And that actually includes renting out your garage or parking spot, okay, or if you rent out some of the farmland or growing plots, okay, so there's ways that you can increase the income on that property, but whatever that income is, right, that income minus your expenses is your cash flow. And if it's a negative number, then it's a negative cash flow. And if it's a positive number, then it's positive cash flow. Right?
That sounds very correct. And I think that when you get into negative cash flow, the biggest thing that I tell people is you need to know your exit strategy. And even when you think you have a good exit strategy, I suggest all people play with option B, option C, and worst case scenario, what happens if you go to option D. So we talked of land banking. Those buyers, investors, they already know their exit strategy. It's a future use of the property. They're going to redevelop, do whatever their vision is for it. They have that. When you get into the creative strategies, I mean, some people just say, well, you know, if all else, if there's no appreciation, nothing else will sell for the same value at a future date. You know that you can, you know, make some money through the mortgage pay down over that period. But what if the market sucks at that future date? You know, then what is your plan B? Can you roll it into your portfolio, maybe keep it as a rental, turn it into a suited property, something like that? A common one that I often see is actually the rent to own as an exit strategy. So a lot of times that'll give you like a 2-3 year window where you know it's going to be sold. And rent to own basically says you're going to rent. Your contract is $1,800 a month, but over the term of your RTO agreement, the buyer actually has to accumulate a 10% or greater down payment. So these are called option payments. Maybe they'll give you $5,000 up front and they agree to pay an extra $400 a month over and above their rent for the few years so that they can accumulate a down payment. That strategy works brilliantly in that those option payments actually help you as the investor cover the negative cash flow, but it is still creating a win-win scenario because now you're helping a home buyer get into a property that will be theirs, and it's also good for the investor in your business because it's now an exit strategy where you know your future sale price, your monthly payments are covered, so that's a good one to look into.
Okay. So now with the rent-to-own strategy, I'm just going to put it out there. It is not for newbie investors. Okay.
No.
Because I do rent-to-own. So I created a program called the No More Rent program. So I will include that in the link down below as well. But it is a strategy that works. And like what you said, Michelle, it's beneficial because you're helping a family get into a home. Otherwise they wouldn't be able to get into, right? So there's a lot of benefits to it. But as the person, as the investor, as the person who actually owns the home, if that family doesn't follow through with their financial obligations, you have to be prepared to kick them out. You have to be prepared to take the legal actions to evict them. Okay. And so that's why I'm saying it's not for newbie investors. So if you are going to go down that path of doing rent to own or no more rent program, which is also called lease option, bring somebody on board like Michelle or myself to guide you through that process because it's not one that you want to take on if it's one of your early properties. Okay. Because there's a lot of legal documentation. There's a lot of discussions that you should have with that family to make sure that they understand what they're doing because they're going to be investing a lot of money with you to be able to do a rent to own, and you don't want to basically screw another family over, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So so that's a great strategy to do, the rent to own. And you brought up a bunch of strategies. Okay. So that's fantastic. And so what I would suggest to anybody watching is that if you want a second opinion about some of the exit strategies, contact Michelle or contact myself, because there's always more than one exit strategy, right? There's multiple strategies and not all of them will be the best for that situation, but you will be able to come up with another alternative that maybe you didn't think about, right? And that exit strategy will be better for you. Okay.
And the other one, thinking of exit strategies, so there's times where, you know, if the negative cash flow, say it's $1,000 a month, that's a pretty big number. If it's a $2 million property, your mortgage pay down is going to exceed the negative cash flow component. But if you're negative $1,000 on a month on say a $400,000 mortgage, that's one that I wouldn't touch unless I had an absolutely clear vision on what am I going to do with the property. Because really you want to know as the investor that the mortgage pay down or the future value of that property is going to exceed the money you put into it. So $100 a month negative cash flow, pretty digestible, especially if you put it over like a 5-year window, something like that, and you know what you're going to get out of the deal. But if you start talking several hundred, thousand or more negative cash flow, not to say it's impossible, but it would take a lot of convincing to get me to buy that property. And that's kind of where the creative stuff lives, though. There's times where we can look and say, well, if a down payment, for example, rather than giving the $30,000 of equity to seller, we can say, well, how do I put that directly onto your mortgage and we reduce the monthly payment? I take everything over. So there's there's a lot of ways that we could look at these creatively, where negative cash flow can be a good thing. But again, it's all about doing your diligence, knowing how much money it's going to cost you total to do this deal over however many years or months it is. And will you come out ahead between the appreciation and the mortgage pay down? I like mortgage calculators because it's just math. You know what those numbers are going to be at a future date. Don't buy on appreciation because we don't know what will happen there. But for these scenarios, calculation-wise, look negative cash flow over that many months versus mortgage pay down, and make sure you're going to come out ahead.
Absolutely. So, all right. So you are exactly like me, Michelle. We can talk for hours and hours and hours about real estate and different strategies and everything under the sun about real estate. So it's actually amazing. My the last time I actually went traveling, my partner said to me, "Huong, can we do this family trip without you talking about real estate?" And then the next day we actually went to go and talked about it. We actually went to a timeshare presentation that he chose to go to. So I was like, okay, fine, I'm not going to talk about real estate anymore. But then he got us into a timeshare thing. So, all right. So do you have any parting words that you would like to share before we sign off?
I'd say I'm going to call it the standard investor disclosure, but for anyone listening to this, do your homework, do your diligence. Don't just dive into a deal because it sounds tasty today. Do your research, connect with a realtor, connect with other investors, and connect with, I'm going to call it your support team, be it your real estate lawyer, manager partners, to make sure any of these deals are good for you. But with the idea of creativity, look at all deals, not just the ones that you find on MLS. As a realtor, ultimately, come see me. I'd love to work with you and help the business that way. But there are a number of good opportunities that don't show up on MLS. They might be right across the street from where you're sitting today. There's the houses that just look like they need some love. Maybe it's aging people. There's a lot of ways to create a win-win scenario without being perceived as like a shark or kind of one of those typical investors. You really can help people, and you can get into real estate with less money down than the typical 20%, 25% that we kind of started the conversation talking about.
God, now you're opening up a whole another can of worms about the no down payment at all.
Say, reach out to your resources, be it other investors, realtors, and have a conversation on how you can make these work. And don't be scared to ask for help. That's the best resource that I found with REIN is really the network. We go there, we learn, but the ability to converse with other investors who've been there, have done that, are analyzing similar deals, that's invaluable. You'll learn a lot just from networking. So rather than not talking about real estate every day, talk about real estate. Let's have a conversation.
Absolutely. So Michelle, thank you so very much. You shed a light on two scenarios where it's actually potentially a good idea to be in a negative cash flow position, right? And this is very controversial it's very controversial, but it's also very contrary to what we learn from a lot of other real estate programs and courses, right? So so thank you very much for sharing that information. And it will go a long way to educate other people, because you're right, there's more than one way of looking at stuff, right? And sometimes being in a negative cash flow situation will get you further ahead because you've got that strategy to do something else with it, right?
Yeah, it's all clarity on what you're doing, where you're going. That's
awesome.
My biggest piece of advice for anyone. When I meet with any investor, be it as an investor or a realtor, my questions are always the same: is what is your goal? What is your long-term plan, and how can I help you achieve those goals? So I think if you start there, you'll come out ahead, even if it is negative cash flow.
Awesome. So thank you very much, Michelle. I really appreciate the time, the knowledge sharing, and we have a networking function tomorrow, right?
Yes, I will. I'll see you there tomorrow evening. But thank you for the opportunity to do this call with you. And
you're welcome.
Look forward to answering any questions that any of the viewers may have on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fantastic. Thank you very much for watching, and please tune in to our next video.
Have a good day.